Dirty moderates, one of the great things that come out of the era of Trumpism have been the formidable force of people who've united together to stop him. Chief among them have been the Never Trumpers, of which many of you know I consider myself part. But today's guest has been at the forefront of what we call the Defeat Trump resistance. As a founding member and leader of the Lincoln Project, probably the largest and most effective anti-Trump organization out there, Reed Galen joins me to talk about the challenges ahead. They were successful in 2020, as we all were, in forming a broad-based coalition to stop the greatest threat to democracy this republic's ever known. But new challenges await as a fractious electorate, a narrow electoral majority, and lots of disinformation to be combated in a time of chaos and precariousness awaits us. So it is with great pleasure I get to do a deep dive into the Lincoln Project, democracy, and all things politics with Reed Galen. Reed, so good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You still fighting for democracy? You gave up?
Every day, all day, every day, man. 6 more months.
6 more months. So, all right. So let's dive into it. Let's go backward. Last night, Indiana, right? Again, Nikki Haley's proving a formidable force in this or among voters who really want nothing to do with Donald Trump. I mean, came in at like 22%. She was doing incredibly well in those suburbs like Carmel, in around Indianapolis and stuff like that. Given that she's dropped out of the race 2 months ago and she still remains formidable, I think this is a good portal into our Never Trump discussion. How do you see the what I call the Lincoln Project voter, that Bannon line voter now that, you guys were so successfully targeted in 2020 that you still need to target? I consider myself one of them, but I'm not on the fence, so you don't have to worry about me. Well, how are you guys approaching this? Because I do feel like it's a different time than 2020, largely because Biden's the incumbent and Trump is now the challenge. What do you think?
Well, no, I think that's 100% right. I mean, I think that what you're seeing is something we saw a little bit of in 2020. I think it's grown, which are, I don't want to call them never Trump Republicans. I'm going to call them non-Trump Republicans, which is they probably voted for him in 2016 because they were just never, ever going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Right. And I think I certainly missed that cue, which was, as someone who grew up a Republican in DC when a lot of that stuff was going on, Hillary was mythological for Republicans and they just weren't going to go that way. I think in 2020, you saw that, a lot of those people, I think, stayed home. Right. If they did for example, in Wisconsin, 50,000 Republican voters who could have pulled the lever for Trump didn't vote in the presidential at all. So that undervote killed him. And now, and then in 2022, you saw, in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, those same voters moved over to whether or not it was Tony Evers or Gretchen Whitmer or Josh Shapiro in big numbers.
Right.
And so I think that universe has grown. But again, it's a universe that, yes, some will go along to Joe Biden. I'm not sure how many, but a lot more will probably stay off of Donald Trump. And I think that's a huge electoral issue for him. You mentioned Indiana, where, again, Haley hadn't been on the ballot in 8 weeks. In Pennsylvania last week, in those collar counties around Philadelphia, they basically broke even. And I think, Adam, these are Republicans who probably equate a Nikki Haley. And again, I make no judgment on how anybody feels about these people, but like what the party looked like with George Bush or John McCain or even Mitt Romney, right?
Something, those were the days.
Right. Something they could be proud of, something that was pro-America. I mean, if you think about it, Donald Trump is not really pro-America. He's pro-him. But he continually denigrates the United States. He brings us down to a level that for a lot of Republicans, they see the United States as the greatest country ever founded. And they see themselves as key members of that American, exceptionalism. And again, that's a whole other argument, but I'm just telling you about where these voters find themselves. And so, I think that, you could call them the Bannon line, which we called them in 20, but I think that's, the amount of voters that are now available to either to peel off of Trump 100% or get across to Biden, I think is much higher than it was 4 years ago. But to your other point, it's also a much different environment this year than it was in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think is interesting, and I wonder how you guys, well, I actually to a certain extent know it, but I want to hear you talk about it. Is it is a challenging thing in this post-pandemic climate because right, so many people wanted Donald Trump defeated, worked hard to get him defeated.
Right.
And look, Joe Biden's a decent guy. I think he's been an honorable steward. I think there's been a lot of challenges that no president can probably overcome from all the stuff related to supply chains and inflation and whatever. And I don't mean that none of his policies contributed to that because I actually think some of them did. But I do think in the realm of where are we as a country, the thing I find myself facing, because you and I share a foxhole, is trying to get people to care about democracy first and foremost, because these are not MAGA people, right? These are not, I guess they're potential LP voters. They're people who say, yes, I care about democracy. That's a luxury right now. Everything's costing me more. Everything is, I hate Donald Trump, and maybe I'll stay home. Maybe I'll write someone in. Maybe I'll vote RFK, Worm Brain Man, or whatever. Whatever they. No, but I mean, it is a challenge because you can't really say to somebody, "Well, that your problems aren't real. Don't you love Bidenomics?" I think that you guys don't do that. The Democrats sometimes do that because I think they're some of the worst messengers as a rule. And it's like, why do you say? In other words, that's not what you say. The challenge is threading that needle. How are you approaching that? Because I think nobody does it quite like you guys. And I know it's a challenge.
Yeah, look, I think that democracy is the foundational piece of it. Some people say it's too, it's too complicated. People can't understand it. I think it's the only thing big enough to probably unite enough people.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But what I would say this is that it's not enough for some voters. More likely, Democratic base voters, right, for whom they're just so upset about a whole bunch of things. Right. And as I was saying to somebody else who I was talking to today, having been a former Republican voters just show up and do what they're told. Democratic voters have to be convinced every cycle to show up. So it's a much different dynamic. I would say this is that, Republicans, to your point about messaging, Republicans fight campaigns in terms of values.
Mm-hmm.
And Democrats tend to fight campaigns in terms of issues.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they get lucky enough that the value proposition they're making, they don't even know, or that they have a big enough boogeyman like a Donald Trump that you saw in 2022, where it was supposed to be a red wave. And, there was just enough of a reaction to the insanity and the number of insane candidates they put up that people were like, I'm not going anywhere near that guy. So I would say this, for the voters who are already probably, okay, democracy matters, right? Okay, I got it. Let's take these kinds of Nikki Haley voters. So we see them as two groups in this research we've done out of our 501c4 called the Lincoln Democracy Institute, LDI. And that's really where we're doing a lot of that work and strategy. Is first we call them Red Dawn conservatives. Okay. These are people who grew up in the 80s, or they were already of age in the 80s. They remember Reagan. They remember being the United States being the good guys and the Russians being the bad guys, and have never seen the Russians as good guys. Yeah. And they don't see them as good guys now. And they support Ukraine. Sure. They support NATO. They don't understand why Trump has this fascination with Putin or why he's willing to do this stuff, and they don't like it. Because they see the value proposition, as I said at the top, is Americans see their place in the world, right? This is, we are an exceptional country, and I am proud to be an American. It's the same reason why at a football game, when the Apache helicopters go flying over, everybody cheers, right? That's America. That's America showing the rest of the world who and what we are. Mm-hmm. The second group anyway, are what we call Dobbs dads. All right. So I'm 48. I've got two daughters that live in the suburbs or the exurbs, whatever it is, educated, financially successful. My kids go to good schools, and if they don't, they go to private, maybe they go to private school. If they're out of the house, they go to college. And for them, the idea of Dobbs was actually a radical decision on the part of the Supreme Court. They probably didn't think about abortion that much, right? Except that, they were nominally pro-life or they were nominally pro-choice, but it was something that they were lucky enough not to have to really deal with, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so now it's an issue for everybody because, Adam, as a former conservative, but we all carry this sort of libertarian chip around with us. Do I want a bunch of politicians in Washington, D.C. or the state capitol, or God forbid, a bunch of unelected judges making decisions for my family? Right. So it's an individual liberty value, right? That's at play, which is, do I want these people telling me what me and my daughters have to do? Right. Or God forbid, my wife gets an ectopic pregnancy. Right. And, my options are she dies or I've got to take her to another state. Right. Because I live in Utah. Right. Which is, forget about it. I mean, Idaho north of us is worse.
Mm.
So I think that, democracy is the foundational piece of this. But then you have to go find the values that those voters, and I don't think this applies just to Republican voters. I think it's all voters, about what they care about. Now, for Democrats, it's anything you care about goes away if Trump comes back. Just make it very clear, right? Whether or not it's choice,
Right.
the environment, cost of schools, cost of living, all of that stuff is off the table if Trump comes back. So just forget about it. You don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the abortion thing, Reed, is something else because I knew. So I'm an ex-Democrat. Okay, I mean, I was born and raised in Florida. I worked for Bob Graham in the Senate
Sure.
way back when, who just passed, the great Bob Graham, and then that was this different kind of Democratic Party too, kind of in the Bill Clinton DLC mold, you might say. And I left the Democrats about 5 years ago, was actually for different reasons, but the abortion issue, right, which really was like the thing of people I grew up with, the sort of Reagan era. I'm born in 1974, or even George Bush Sr. Yeah, they're running in a pro-life ticket, but we want tax cuts. We want a strong defense. We believe in personal responsibility. That's, Alan Reagan put Kennedy on and Sandra Day O'Connor and David Souter. At the end of the day, they're not really going to do this. And I've heard two things. I've heard from, honorable people in the pro-life movement. Oh, yes, we've wanted this, but we don't want it criminalized. But then I've heard from other Republican strategists, damn, man, you guys are nuts. We didn't think you're going to do this. It was a good fundraising tool. But here you are. The McCain-Romney suburbs, for lack of a better term, right are voting blue. And
yeah, look, the dog caught the car.
Helps Biden, but it's an interesting phenomenon to watch.
Yeah, well, I think, first and foremost, like the dog caught the car and it keeps catching the car. But I think it's important to understand the genesis of what we call the pro-life movement, Adam, which is, remember, if you go back to, was it 1973 when Roe was decided, people across the political spectrum thought that this was a good decision, including the Southern Baptist Conference, right? Like everybody thought that this was, not everybody, but generally speaking, everybody thought that this was a reasonable decision to an issue that needed to be addressed in the United States and hadn't been properly addressed. Okay. Then you get to like the late 70s, right? Carter's in office. It's post Watergate, right? The Republican Party, the conservative movement's in shambles. They never liked Nixon. Right, Nixon was never a true believer.
No, he wasn't a true believer.
No. In fact, I mean, they loved Barry Goldwater. Like Barry Goldwater was there, but Reagan was a good substitute. And so, Jerry Falwell and all these guys, they needed something to gin up the religious base, and abortion became that thing. Right. And so, if you understand that there was a very well-funded movement going back to the 70s, and I think, Adam, sometimes our listeners, especially on the Democratic side, and even a lot of Republicans, don't understand, like, this is something that's been at work for 50 or 60 years, right? A lot of this stuff. It was all just a play for power and money, right? Like that's all this ever was.
Yeah.
And so do some people believe in it honestly? I'm sure they do, but let's be clear that the genesis of it wasn't protecting life per se. It was, how do we gin up enough, Republicans in the hustings to take out Jimmy Carter and replace him with Ronald Reagan, who, okay, maybe he was pro-life, but let's be clear, like Ronald Reagan didn't go to church. This was not a religious guy. He had been the head of the
California.
He'd been head of SAG-AFTRA, for Christ's sakes, right? So like, this was not a guy who, spent a lot of time reading the Bible. And, George H.W. Bush too, think about it, when he first ran for Congress in Houston, I think in the 60s, his nickname amongst Republicans was Rubbers because he believed in birth control.
Planned Parenthood, right?
Yeah. And so now you get to a place where, again, Republican operatives, look, when you've got Kellyanne Conway going on Fox News going, we're in a lot of trouble because of this. Like, the professionals in the Republican Party know it, but of course the activists are fine with it because they think they've won. To them, this is a win, right? Because they're thinking about this not in the context of just politics, but Adam, they're thinking about it in the context of the supernatural, right? They got God on their side.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of Barry Goldwater, a few things there. There's that famous, it's on a meme, but it's true. He said, it's interesting he was their guy because he was really a libertarian. In later years was openly pro-choice and pro-gay rights.
Right.
He had that famous quote where he said, listen, if you let these folks in the party and they take it over, I promise you, they're going to try to turn it into a Christian revival tent. There's no compromise with them. You can't deal with these preachers, and he took heat for that back in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And, Reagan was definitely pro-choice in California, and to your point about rubbers. And, George H.W. Bush was an Episcopalian, old line Republican. But you're right. You see this, you load it into the rhetoric in support for Trump, which is astonishing, right? Yeah. All of these goals of the Christian right? Which, by the way, famously, Bill Sapphire wrote in the New York Times in the 80s, and you could Google it, look, that the Reagan said to his team about the religious right, we're going to jolly them along. It was a known thing. We'll use them for votes, and, we're not going to play into this. But all of that is to say that now, right, the thrice married man who probably paid for more abortions than anybody, who changed the Supreme Court, has got people, right, ready to impose their theocracy on everybody. It's an astonishing thing as he commandeers. He's going to probably get 46% of the vote, isn't he? I think so.
Yeah. 46 is probably a pretty good number. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he got votes. Roughly he's going to get a certain number. It's not like nobody's voting for him, even though he probably will lose, one hopes. What about that? The fact that the Christian right didn't see its goals realized under a different Republican era, which was much more ecumenical. But yet this guy, can lead the way. And it's like the values coalition. You talk about that. It doesn't exist.
Well, I'd say this. Look, I worked for George W. Bush, right? And I remember, I don't remember if it was when he was still governor or when he was first running for president. And, he got asked about abortion. Yeah. And, he is a Christian and a conservative. But even then he said, I'm pro-life. We should really focus on how we make sure we don't have as many unwanted pregnancies, right? Because the less unwanted pregnancies we have, the less abortions we'll have, which is really another call for birth control, or sex education, Adam, God forbid. Yeah. But, to your point about that, we'll jolly them along. That's what we did for decades. Right. And then you saw, like in 2008, remember in the 2008 primaries, you saw, Mike Huckabee, right, was second, right? So now they're making their attention known. And then, then Barack Obama gets elected. I think there was a major backlash. You saw the Tea Party and all that. And then in 2012, remember, it was Rick Santorum, right? A very arch Catholic, right? Who's in second place. So you could make an argument that, yes, Trump was the weirdest of the weird, the weirdest, bedfellow, so to speak. But I actually wrote about this a few months ago, is that all of the work that the evangelical and the arch-right movement did was in preparation when they got lucky enough to find someone like Trump who was willing to be their vehicle. It's precisely because he doesn't believe in anything.
Isn't that amazing? It's in spite of itself. Reed, one thing I wanted to talk about with you, which I always had a good conversation. I always talk to current Republicans or former Republicans about this, to go back to the beginning. So I don't know that everybody knows your backstory, your dad, Rich Galen, and all that stuff. Like, let's go back to the beginning. Like, how did you get involved in politics to begin with? And what made you a Republican in the old days?
It's very well. What made me a Republican is very boring. Was my dad worked on Capitol Hill for Republicans, so it was just straight political socialization. Nothing more interesting than that. Although I will say that I've never been a conservative, right? I was a Republican, but I was never a conservative. Now I'm not even a Republican. But look, and just to give you a sense, I went to a private high school in Dallas, Texas, And I was editor of the high school newspaper, and I wrote 2 editorials that got me in a lot of trouble my senior year, Adam. The first one was, and remember, this is 1994.
Right.
The Second Amendment was meant for killing bears and beating off redcoats. It's not what you need now. And racism is a problem. And I'm not sure even to this day, 30 years later, which one got me in more trouble with my classmates, which were all white, obviously. But so like I always had I was never quite a very good Republican. And then, I went to work for George W. Bush in 1997 when I was a senior in college. He was a first term governor.
Yeah.
And, like my dad had worked for, his dad, had worked for George H.W. Bush. I thought I was going to be the next Woodward and Bernstein. I went to college for journalism, and then it was going to take forever to get out of college. So I decided, well, I'll do politics. That's sitting there for me. Other kids went to summer camp, and I went to the National Republican Congressional Committee. But then it was, again, it was a job, right? Maybe I'm an activist now, but I certainly ever wasn't until Trump came along, right? I was just one more guy working in Republican politics, and that sounds self-serving, but I got to be honest with you, I was blissfully ignorant of most things. I think if when it came to policy, I spent 0 time thinking about policy. It wasn't my job, right? I was an advance man. You go to Des Moines, you set up the stage, the president arrives. You go to Paris, the president arrives. Like, great gig in your 20s, right? Requires almost no ideological thought whatsoever, right? Like 100% logistical, and organizational. So Trump comes along, and there you are. I just I think George Bush, when in 1998, when he ran for governor again, I think he got like 46-48% of the Latino vote in Texas.
Yeah.
Right. He was wildly popular, and his issues, unlike his dad or Reagan, were almost all domestic policy.
Yep.
Right. It was education and immigration and economy and all that kind of stuff. But for 9/11, we don't know what would have happened with his presidency. And obviously it took a turn, and it got away from him and from all of us, I think. But his presidency paved the way for someone like a Barack Obama, which then primed the pump for these very people we're now talking about, which was we jollied them on. I mean, look, if you used to go to focus groups and of very conservative Republicans, and you put like a picture of Nancy Pelosi on the screen, boo, hiss, right? Yeah. But if you put a picture of Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan on the screen, like, they were throwing stuff, right?
Right. They hated them more, right?
Well, they hated them more because they saw them as betrayers of the faith. Absolutely. And they were in the context of those people, right? They weren't social
rhinos, aren't they?
Right,
Rhinos?
they were rhinos. I mean, look, Mitch McConnell, he saw like conservative judges as a way to maintain a conservative way of life in America, because he knew, like all these people knew, and that's why they were always so focused on the judges, that the country was getting away from them culturally and politically, and this was the only way to sort of put a stop to that, or at least to slow it down.
Right.
But McConnell didn't believe it. No. Right. And Ryan was like an Ayn Rand, acolyte. To him, it was all tax cuts for the rich and privatizing government.
Right.
And other than that, he's a Catholic guy. He's probably pretty socially conservative. He's probably pro-life. But like when push came to shove, he was going to keep the government open. When push came to shove, he was going to do what was right for the country, even if it took him all the time in the world to get where he needed to go. When push came to shove, he was probably going to make a deal with Obama or whoever it was. I mean, it cost Boehner his job, right, when Obama was president. And now you see like Mike Johnson, right? I have no love for Mike Johnson whatsoever, but like, you sit in that chair and he's like, oh, I guess I got to do these things because it matters. So yeah, I think that it was, ignorance, a growing dissatisfaction, and all the things that happen, Adam, as we've seen when we have massive economic and political and demographic disruption or dislocation. These things start to happen, and then you throw COVID on top of it, and it just sort of lit the fire and a whole bunch of stuff.
Right. I just recently spoke with an author who has a book out about 1968, and it's really fascinating. I say this to go back to your point of how many of your listeners and mine, our listeners,
Mm.
who I think look to us to provide some historical context. Admittedly, I'm a geek. I've been living and breathing this stuff, even though I didn't
Sure.
live it in the way you lived it. I have
No,
all.
look, I got 40 books here on my desk that I got to get to, right?
I know the feeling. It's author after author, but in the way that we love it and live and breathe it. And again, my first life was in the theater, but I was a political, junkie always
Sure.
before I got to the fortunate to do what I'm doing now. 1968, people are trying to figure out, like you're pointing out, well, how did this abortion thing come? And you're like, guys, for 50 years, there's been a movie, Phyllis Schlafly, The Religious Right, Moral Majority. You can
Right.
trace this, Ralph Reed, it all goes back. But the other thing about where the Republican Party ended up, when you look back about 68, it's not Nixon. It's actually, there's a lot of new history about Nixon, who was not a true believer in the Southern strategy. Not exactly true. It's partially true. It's George Wallace.
Sure.
George Wallace was the grievance candidate. Yes, he was a racist, but by 1968, right, he couldn't play openly racist in the same way as he could prior to that. He certainly
Right.
was. But he did the hard hat grievance, the system's against you, the beginning of this very angry, arguably right-wing populism, though he was a Democrat running as an independent and always really stayed a Democrat. That then became the resistance, that became the Tea Party, that became the people throwing the stuff at the Mitch McConnell on the street,
Right.
Paul Ryan, that ended up finding a redoubt, if you will, in MAGA.
Right.
And it takes that. I'm not bliss. I don't like George Wallace. Absolutely.
No, sure.
But I mean, Trump was then able to run and say, yeah, Mexicans are going to come over bringing drugs and be rapists, and we're going to ban Muslims, all that stuff, which really has weirdly, but absolutely, and kind of astonishingly, has roots in a former Democratic Southern governor of Alabama. Not alone, but you can trace it.
Well, I think you can go back even further. The last two major candidates, independent candidates, to gain any significant number of electoral votes were Wallace in 68, yes, but also Strom Thurmond in 48 on the Dixiecrat ticket. And what states did they win? They both won the old Confederacy, right? And where is that now? Where is the heart and soul of MAGA remains there? They've added the Mountain West. And Texas and North Carolina, just through the machinations of, frankly, Democrats ignoring state and local races for 25 years. But that's where it remains. The heart and beat, the beating black heart of this stuff, lack of a better way to put it, still resides in those same places of white grievance. And of, again, we're going to be a majority minority country here in the next 20 or so years. That's going to happen. You know why? Because white people got very economically successful, right, in a post-industrial world. And what happens? Stopped having kids, right? This is what happens. And so, and folks further down the economic scale still having more kids. People like, look, I had a conversation with a friend of mine. He's in his early 30s. Yeah. He's like, should I have kids? I'm like, well, do you want kids? We don't know. Okay. He's like, but we love to travel and we love to do this stuff. And they go all over the world and they do really cool stuff. Great. I'm like, look, the world doesn't need you, or at least America doesn't need you to have 9 kids to work the farm, because 3 of them are going to die from diphtheria or something. Right. And you still have to have six kids working the land, right? Or going out because, mom got sick or dad got sick. He can't work anymore. You guys got to go to work. Like, that world doesn't exist anymore, at least not for, wealthy white Americans. And so, it's just a sea change of epic proportions. All of this stuff happening, all of this stuff historically, Adam, tends to happen at one time. But to your point about Wallace, the thing about Nixon was maybe he wasn't a believer in the Southern strategy ideologically, but he was a means and ends guy. He's like, well, if that's how I got to win, like this is also Mr. Watergate, right? So,
yeah, no. I by the way, I have a very what's the word? Very deep fixation on Nixon as a historical figure.
Right.
So I always bring it up, and absolutely, he was all things. That's what makes him. He contained multitudes. You're right.
Right.
He was an NAACP liberal, by the way. An old Lincoln Republican is who he was until even in 60, he got 32% of the black vote. He then did a little bit of, not quite as nefariously as George Wallace, but he adopted it because he needed to win, especially by 68, 72.
Yeah. And I mean, you think about it, Eisenhower, right, sent the 101st Airborne to desegregate schools in Little Rock.
Yeah, that was
right?
the Republican Party. I mean, Lincoln.
And not necessarily even because he was because he was a self-avowed forerunner on civil rights,
No.
but because he said, this is what the Supreme Court has ordered. I am the chief magistrate, as they used to call it back in the old days, of the United States government. This is the law of the land now, and I'm going to go do it. Right? He didn't see it as to him. It wasn't a moral issue. It was a law and order issue. This is the law. This is how we're going to go.
That's right. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating thing. To the point of I think the election coming up and the challenges of just living in this incredibly narrow margin of an electorate was so frustrating. I grew up, not that we need to have 49 state landslides, but I mean, even Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, just waiting with bated breath for what's going to happen in Wisconsin. It's like the whole country's hostage to like sixth place, right? 99% of voters have no say in a weird way. But one of the things that's been noted, and I know I can pick this apart with you because it gets lost in the conversation or people on the left get defensive. There is a shift away from the Democrats and it might, albeit small, but it's growing larger in the Latino world than in the African American world, but of working class men who don't feel connected culturally and otherwise to the Democratic Party. Okay, before you answer, I want to say this. Of course, Biden's going to win the majority of the black vote. He's going to win the majority of the Latino vote. But in election one in the margins, some of these defections are crucial, and to act like that they're not because people are unhappy with inflation or they want a secure border and they're not okay with some of the woke stuff. They're not white. I think these are challenges that are not necessarily your responsibility or mine, but I think this can trip up the left a little bit. And when the discussion is brought up by honorable people who try to analyze it, it can get shut down. Do you guys have a strategy to kind of appeal to these people? Because I don't, this is not just white working class men reelecting Trump.
It's exactly the right question. And let me answer the second part first. Yes, but not because we thought we'd need to. Right. We thought that this was taken care of, but of course, that's why we showed up in 2019 to begin with. I would say, the thing about is I've observed the Democratic Party now and fought alongside them for almost 5 years, is that sometimes the elites of the party on the coasts have a fundamental misunderstanding of their own coalition. They automatically believe brown equals Democrat. Right. Okay, well, that's not necessarily untrue, but they have a very large coalition, a very diverse coalition, which can be a strength if everyone understands how those pieces interlock, but can also be a weakness if you refuse to accept the fact that you're, even if you're the party of diversity, you refuse to accept said diversity. So, for example, I think there's a difference between social conservatism, which we were talking about a little while ago, which is this hardcore sort of religious, how you live your life. I believe that I should be able to tell you how you live your life from a biblical perspective, and abortion tends to be the top issue there, and a cultural conservatism.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
And so to your point about Latinos and African Americans and Asians, right? They tend
largely men, because black women are very strongly Democratic.
Right.
Men, working class men seems to be the trend.
Right. But my point is that like they tend to be more family oriented, right? They tend to believe in traditional values. I don't know that they necessarily go to church anymore, but they probably don't have, when I say this, I don't want to sound elitist myself, but they see the world through the prism by which, like, I got to go to work every day. So let me say this. Let me do a thought experiment with you. You're from Florida, right? So I-4, right? The big I-4 corridor goes through Orlando, right? Yep. So let's say it's August 15th. It's about 9 million degrees on the tarmac, right? Out there. And these guys are doing road work. There's a white guy, a Latino guy, and a black guy, right? And they're all out there. They all live in different neighborhoods, right? Their kids all go to different schools. Maybe maybe the Latino guy, they speak Spanish at home. Who knows, right?
Right.
But when the white woman with the little white dog goes by in the white Range Rover, they all think the same thing. She's in there and we're out here. Right.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And
class.
Right. And so, it's I could make an argument that it would be very difficult for a political party to have an expectation that working class men will come back to them when we hear all sorts of talk about college loan forgiveness.
Right.
Okay, that's great. But you know what? If you go to work with, your buddy and your cousin on a truck every day,
Right.
right? Maybe you're hoping your kid will be the first in your family to go to college, right?
Right.
But when you see that, right, it doesn't make you feel like the party that you ascribe to or takes you for granted really understands your needs, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
If you are a guy in the trades, plumber, carpenter, whatever, right?
Mhm.
Um, you know, the union guys might say, "Oh yeah, you have an expectation you're going to vote for Democrats." I'm not even entirely sure that's necessarily true among all the building trades
I think
anymore.
that's right. Yeah.
But you do feel like these people don't understand me, they don't care about me, they don't like me, whatever it is. And so I think for working class men, it's like it is a little bit of a protest, which is, like, Adam, I ain't fixing anything in my house, right? That doesn't require my electric screwdriver, right?
Yeah.
I can't
I'm
plumb.
attached. I'm incompetent in that field.
Right. And so like, and the guy that has the nicest house in my neighborhood's the town electrician, right?
Right.
And so I think that the thing that Democrats are missing is the fact that their president, their standard bearer, their nominee, can absolutely and should speak to those people,
He
right? To
does.
those guys.
No. Right.
Um, but
Scramble.
you have a party apparatus that doesn't want to believe it, right? They want to spend more time talking about what's going on in Columbia or University of Chicago or whatever,
Well,
right?
I think those things have. Well, I think those things matter, but again, I think they matter because they don't work to the benefit of Democrats. They work against them and for the people we're talking about. Not for, but as wow, this party's out of touch. Why are they burning American flags? Now, you know what I mean. All that gets roped up. I think it's connected. But I want to say this about that. Somebody asked John F. Kennedy used to say. I want to say this about that. Somebody asked me, about what do I think some challenges are, and I said, well, I can only tell you what I study and what I know, and I don't think any of
Mhm.
this is revelatory, but it's worth unpacking with you. Number one, Democrats have become the college-educated party, and the Republicans have become the non-educated party. Okay, largely, and that's been a real shift. I mean, a real switch. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Going back to certainly the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the other thing we've lost in politics, Reed, and you grew up in it and which I think makes the left sometimes siloed to their disadvantage, and I think has also made the Republicans an off the deep end group of nut jobs,
Mhm.
is neither party has the ideological rural urban divide. We used to have liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans, moderates, right? And then moderate Democrats, liberal Democrat. It's partisan now. And we
Yeah.
don't have that. So what ends up happening, right, is that, you take a guy like Joe Manchin, forget what we think about him, forget his stuff, okay? He's Joe Manchin. But he's a typical kind of southern leaning conservative Democrat. I know in a tight Senate and everything being on the line, it was like, oh my God, but he can't win without voting that way. And that's no different from other people historically in a party that spoke to their particular region. And I think the loss of that with both parties has been really it's been a seismic shock to the system. And it's made us this stupid binary, which, hey, you and I know democracy's on the line, but
Right.
people feel, good God, that, as our mutual friend, certainly my good friend Joe Walsh says, the Republicans are crazy, but the Democrats look down on us.
Yeah.
And it's so I think those are valid things that don't make everybody a MAGA supporter.
No, I mean, I would say that, even people who aren't MAGA, right? Like I have relatives who aren't necessarily MAGA. They don't really like Trump, but they watch a lot of Fox News,
Yeah.
right? So they're sort of in the bloodstream. It's in their bloodstream. I think Joe's right. And I think, look, Joe's had as big a transformation as any of us have, right?
Yeah.
And he, like so many of us, he put everything on. He lost everything economically, right? For taking his stance. And yeah, and so I think that's right. I mean, I'll relate a story. So a friend of mine, a guy that I work with, was at a thing yesterday, sort of a bipartisan thing, and there were a bunch of, he's a conservative guy, but former Republican, but 100% pro democracy, and says, look, I disagree with these people on a lot, but like these are our allies, right? We call it the Stalin rule, right? You work with people you never otherwise would have thought to work with.
I like that.
And, he started getting hectored by progressives for this and that, and taking they blamed him for this and they blamed him for number 1 through 10. And eventually he's like, you know what? I'm out of here. I'm out. Like, I've done more in this space here in this country and around the world than any of you all have put together. I don't need the trouble.
Right.
Right. I don't need the trouble. And the organizers are like, please come back. He's like, why? Why would I come back?
What do I
I'm
need
trying
to
to
do?
help. I'm trying to help. Right. I'm on your side. And you want to criticize me for A, B, and C? Like, get out of here.
Hey, Reed, I can't tell you how many a Democratic guests, I'm not going to name them. Some of them have said it on my show, which I was like, wow, have criticized you, me, I mean, you by name, Lincoln Project,
Right.
me, Joe, all of us, get in line. You're not Democrats. Thanks for your help, but get in the back of the line. We know how to run the party. And someone's like, oh, you really don't know how to run your party? I'm sorry. Like
Nor
without a lot of us, well, no, meaning without a lot of us trying to convince our fellow conservatives. And, the reason I also left the Democrats is I realized I'm more conservative than Democrats. I'm definitely not a conservative, but I'm a very limited government capitalist libertarian type.
Right.
You don't want us to get it. You're actually asking us to maybe, I don't know, coalesce, but maybe not. You think you have the votes, and it's so I know how this guy feels. I haven't been attacked quite as readily because I came at it differently, but I've heard that, well, we're there, but it's not for us to decide. I'm like, well, I don't think it's a question of us deciding. I think it's us trying to help you guys win on behalf of democracy. Why would you turn that down? It's fascinating. I'm sure you experience it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what I remember being at a dinner party, and get asked the same question, and you could, if you're at a dinner party for 2 hours, the first hour and 45 minutes of it is, why do you think the Democratic Party is so screwed up? And these are Democrats, right? And they all agree with everything you say. We're elitist. We look down on people. We can't agree. And, I think, going back to the whole coalition piece is Republicans, listen, they got plenty of wealthy, plenty of college educated people that vote for them, but it's 90% white, right? It's a very different sort of, it's a different, you don't have to be very creative to talk to a monolithic party.
Right.
And so, Democrats, they have a lot of people. But again, they tend, you're right. Look, they tend to be, if you went to Harvard, you're smarter than everybody. And I like this joke, Adam. How do you know somebody went to Harvard?
How?
They'll tell you. So,
how about William Buckley's adage, the famous ad that Bill Buckley said he'd rather hire any unknown person off the street than someone who went to Harvard Business School. You probably heard that,
Yeah, I mean, but of course he went to
like
Yale.
Well, no.
And
Well, yes, he meant, but he was trying to be the populist, the common man, in his. He was trying to make a point about that, but the idea that yes, you're up your own ass. That's what.
Right, and so it's and then the part that then it becomes, okay, how do you make decisions? Well, first and foremost, like, we have to get everybody's opinion. I've sat in some of these meetings years ago, like, all right, we have to get everybody's opinions. Okay, well, of course, once you get past two people, right, there's going to be a divergence of opinion. Well, we can't make everybody happy. Well, how do we make the least number of people unhappy? Well, now you've had something that's like so uninteresting, and you can see this like in their political advertising, right? Like here's how Democrats make ads, Adam. They run a poll, right? And they look at the top 6 issues. Then they run some focus groups, right? Then they create an ad, and then they test it to within an inch of its life on Facebook until it has 0 sharp edges and is just basically a donut, right? A powdered donut. And then they can't figure out why.
All the likes by liberals.
Right. And then it's like, and so then it becomes sort of a cover your ass thing, which is, well, if you win, see, it worked. And if you didn't, well, we tested it. Right. And what I think, I think we see this going back to the Hillary campaign, right? Was the Hillary campaign was 100% data driven. I think unfortunately for the secretary, she couldn't really successfully articulate why she should be president.
That's right.
And again, going back,
Bill told her. Bill went to the bar. He went to the Wisconsin. This was in the New York Times, famous, and he went to Robbie Mook and Hillary and said, hey, honey, they don't like you very much out there. I talked to the, the Bubba vote. Oh, well, BS. We have a blue wall. It's like, okay,
right. Right. And we forget that, a lot of these voters in the middle, we used to call them Reagan Democrats, right? They were, I mean, this is not a new
handily for Bill Clinton twice. It's
right. These are not, these people are not new phenomenons. The difference is now it might be that, you've got a guy who's a registered Democrat in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, who hasn't voted for a Democrat in 25 years.
Right.
We see more and more people who just don't register for a party in party registration states at all.
Right.
And so that's the other part, is that if a voter starts out fundamentally believing that you don't like them, right, it doesn't matter what you say to them. The best you can get is that they stay home, right? That's the best you can get, is that they don't participate. And so I think that, you have to, I mean, it sounds sort of, old fashioned, but you do have to meet people where they are. And, and I think too, that,
You do. Yeah.
you have to, I mean, that's the part about the difference between what Republicans do nowadays and what Democrats do nowadays is the Republican / MAGA movement is a holistic thing,
Yeah.
right? The Republican Party is its political wing. It puts forth candidates for office, right? And then it's got its financiers and it's got its front groups like all the Stephen Miller stuff. And it's got its media wing, it's Fox News, OAN,
Yeah.
all this stuff, right? And then it's got its legal wing with Leonard Leo. And then it's got Trump sort of at the top of the, in the middle of the circle. And so it's 100% flywheel spinning all day, every day, right? And some of it's not overtly political. A lot of it's not overtly political, but it's always moving a message, moving a message, moving a message. Democrats like CNN, I don't know what it is they do. And MSNBC, like it's got such a small audience and it speaks to such a narrow group. Like I'm happy to go on MSNBC. I go on probably twice a month.
Yeah.
But again, it's not an answer for what MAGA has, if that makes sense.
And it doesn't also reflect, I think, a lot of, to your point, what might be the undervote of people who aren't going to vote, or, the work you guys have to do to move them. They're not Trump voters, but they're not necessarily Biden voters, because certainly CNN does that. It's, well, we got to, on the more liberal shows, we've got to talk about this great economy. Well, it depends on who you are. It's not untrue that there's creation of jobs, but what kind of jobs have been created? Some people are holding 2 jobs. The truth remains about people not having more than $400 in case of an emergency, like 40% of Americans. And I don't think that anybody should look down on that. Again, that's not Joe Biden's fault, but it's not like that. A lot of people's situation doesn't feel all that secure.
Well, I think that's right. And, so I interviewed a guy a few weeks ago named Mondale Robinson, and he's from North Carolina, and he runs something called the Black Men's Voter Project. And he's a mayor of Enfield in the county. I can't recall the county. It's sort of eastern North Carolina. Okay. The unemployment rate for Black men in his county is 18%. 18%. And he asked me, what would happen if the unemployment rate for white guys was 18%? I'm like, well, that's the Great Depression. That's blood in the streets. Right. And so, what he said, and I think this is an important thing for all of us to remember about the different coalitions is, I didn't know this until he told me. And this is why I like to talk to everybody. 9 out of 10 Black men in this country, Adam, don't go to church anymore. Right. So trying to reach them at the pulpit, you're going to get some, but you're not going to get a lot.
Right.
And the other part too, he said to me is like, don't come to me with your democracy, because for my people, it's never been real anyway. And he said, and don't come to me scaring me with Donald Trump, because all we've ever seen is boogeymen, and he's just one more. And I've heard this from others too, which is, and I'm speaking about the African-American vote in particular. Yeah. I did have a meeting with a church leader a couple of years ago who said, look, my people are going to do one of 2 things. They're either going to vote for the Democrat or they're going to stay home. They know what they get with the Republican, but year in and year out, they look out their windows and their lives don't change, and I'm afraid that, that lack of attention or care, right? Well, I mean, what's the opposite of love? Indifference. That indifference, I'm hoping to God, Adam, doesn't come home to roost this year.
Well, to that point, I've actually heard the same thing from Black voters and Black leaders. The other thing is, as somebody once told me, somebody who worked kind of in local Black politics, when I said to them, well, you're not really on board, it sounds like, with a lot of traditional Democratic Party programs.
Sure.
And they said, you're right. But they said, here's the deal. Most people, despite what the media says, we're capitalists, we're free marketeers, but we aren't going to vote for a white supremacist party in the Republican Party. So what is happening is, right, they don't feel a difference from the Democratic Party, but what choice do they have? And I think this has been such a missed opportunity for the party of Lincoln. I mean, it's gone on for a long time, certainly since the 60s, to never, I mean, both parties should be serving everybody in an ideal world.
Yeah.
Right? There shouldn't be, this is the Black vote, and nobody cares, this whole, and I know we have to do piecemealing now just to get out alive in any of these elections, we being the collective we. But right, this is a true story. Like a lot of people who are in the minority community, especially Black community, have said the same thing. It's not that they're like, wow, Joe Biden passed the Anti-Inflation Act or inflation. It's not like, wow, what does that do for them? But they're not going to vote for Trump. They're not going to vote for Trump's people. You know what I mean? And I think there's an opening. right, to convince them. But it's also why you do see some working class Black and Latino people going, hey, the economy was, whether it's true or not, they feel
Right.
that better before COVID. They remember lower unemployment. They really are, they own a barbershop and they don't care. They're not going to vote on all this other stuff. Again,
Right.
it's a challenge, right?
Well, and just to extend that, the other part too is that, and I think both political parties are rotten at this, is that they really only start talking to voters, like 12 weeks before an election.
Right.
And then it's just transactional at that point. What can I give you? What can I say? Excuse me, in desperation to get you to do what I need to do. Right.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess. Well, I like to ask you this because I've been really thinking about this since you're a student of history. I think we're living through a realignment, right? We don't know what's
Yeah.
going to come out on what side here. Do you have and I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but do you have a kind of overall idea of a post-Trump, like, conservative or Republican movement? I mean, is there like a Liz Cheney party I can be a member of? Is there such a, I know not literally, but is there a place
Yeah.
for, like, well, conceivably, were you Rick Wilson, me, Liz Cheney, Michael Steele, and I don't know, I don't know, moderate Democrats could go. That's not the Democratic Party. I understand we're teaming with them. Is there some kind of future you? Just a question. I'm always wrestling.
I think so. I think the thing so look, I worked for something back in 2017 and 2018 called the Serve America movement.
Okay.
And SAM was what it was called. And it was the idea of, like, let's create the kind of party you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And you've seen this now with, like, Forward and Andrew Yang. And it took me a long time. And the Lincoln Project really crystallized this for me. Is third parties make the biggest mistake of thinking I can take a little bit from over here and a little bit from over there, and people will come together. And but again, they have that whole. There's this, like, I don't want anybody to dislike me, right?
Right.
If you're going up against a duopoly that's been in place since 1854, by definition, that system is going to see any new entrant as a hostile body and do everything it can to kill it, right?
Right.
And so what I would say is this, is that a new party must be founded not on issues, but on belief.
Mm-hmm.
What do you believe in?
Right.
Because here's the thing is, remember, if you create a solid third party, you don't need 50% plus one, you need 33% plus one, right?
Right.
The Republican Party did not start because it was the party of lower taxes and national security, right? It started because it was the party of saying no more slavery, right?
Right.
No more slavery. And that belief split the Northern Whigs from the Southern, from the Southern slaveholders. The Whigs are gone in 6 years, right? Gone in 6 years. And a complete and total realignment. And, the Republican Party was not what it sort of evolved that way post Reconstruction. And it always had an isolationist wing. I mean, you think about Robert Taft and Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. But it really didn't pick up, the racial element of, frankly, the Democratic Party until the 60s, when, I mean, Johnson even said, like, we've lost the South for a generation, and talked probably for in perpetuity. So we've seen a realignment. The last one you brought up earlier was the 60s, and I think we could see something different. But let me just step back. I mean, the idea that we live in a country now, Adam, and we have for some time now, where you can watch any movie ever made anytime you want.
I know,
you
it's
can
great, isn't it? You can watch Goodfellas for the 18th time.
Right. You can order anything you want on Amazon, and it'll show up in 2 days, if not the same day, depending on where you live. Right. And now we have the same two parties that we've had for, I mean, the last major new party in this country is the Republican Party.
I know, 1855.
And it's been,
there's not been any new formidable party since.
Right. And again, look, I mean, back, we didn't have all the ballot access rules and all the things that keep outsiders out and all the other stuff. So there's a lot of, like, structural work that needs to be done. But at its core, and I'm sorry I've gone on so long, is there has to be a belief system. Like, my issue with Republicans is that the things that its leadership believe, I think, are unconscionable and fundamentally unpatriotic and anti-American. My issue with the Democrats is I'm not sure on any given day what exactly it is they believe in. Right.
I know.
Um,
Well, I have to say this. I think that the thing, I mean, you working alongside them, and I myself used to be one, but I was never on the left. Living in California has crystallized this for me.
mhm.
Okay. I really despise, and I even hate to use that word, the California Democrat, all of them. Newsom, I can't. By the way, I will never be voting for Gavin Newsom for president. I didn't vote for him for governor. I don't care who's running. I will be the guy you'll have to chase sitting on the fence. Like you're probably, what do you mean, Adam? You mean no? They have the fundamental progressive belief, which has overwhelmingly come to dominate California, is this: pass more laws, and the world gets better. I mean, this is age old to the left. Meaning, what do they believe? Oh, there's a problem. Oh, there's a parking issue. Pass a law. Oh, there's a climate. Okay, well, let's spend another 40 billion. Do we have the money? No, it doesn't matter. It just, what I mean is they have a utopian belief that social program engineering can actually solve every problem. That's why I'm not a Democrat, right? But they do believe that. That's all they really fundamentally believe. That's why people were so anxious about Biden's accomplishments when they list them off and they see that people don't, it doesn't resonate, which is not what Lincoln Project does. Thankfully, you have a larger message. Well, of course, it doesn't resonate. What the hell does it matter to somebody about this bill with half the money hasn't been spent? They don't see it yet. They don't know what it is. It's Washington talk. It's all abstract. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
But it's the whole movement. Especially if the party keeps tacking left. Yep, it's pass more laws. That scares the crap out of me too. Doesn't scare me more than MAGA and authoritarian, right. But ideologically, it's a real problem for me. That's why I asked you the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where, in this next 6 months, Adam, this is where the rubber meets the road. Right. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not going to be a Democrat. I think that the president has done things that needed to be done. I mean, look, the infrastructure stuff, that's, we're 30 years late on that, right? Like Ross Perot in 1992 said we should be doing this stuff, 100%, right?
I think, and that's why it got a lot of Republican votes.
Right. And so I think that, to your point, the things that create economic upward mobility, right. And educational mobility. Right. And when I say that, I mean, like, and maybe it's not the right word, educational attainment, I think are the two core things. Look, I don't want to get into like what a curriculum should look like, because I think that's you're missing the forest for the trees. Sure. But I think that not everything, laws can be, we got a problem, let's solve it. Right. And we got plenty of problems to solve because, again, so, let's take social media, right, or technology, okay. Right. In 1996, we make a decision. We're not going to regulate any of this stuff because we want to see what we can make happen. Okay. 30 years later, we've seen what happens.
You mean the Telecommunications Act?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And we say, okay, it's going to be laissez-faire. We're going to be hands off. Now we've got AI coming down the pike. And of course, what are the AI guys saying? Don't regulate us. Don't regulate us. Right. Like we need to have unfettered access to blah, 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 blah. Like, well, maybe that's not true. Right. Maybe you don't get to make that decision. So like, I think that, we talk about the American dream. I'd like to believe in it. I think unfortunately too many people don't believe in it. But I'll say this too, is that, I think that economically we've reached sort of in-state Ayn Randism, right? There's not much more laissez-faire I think we can squeeze out of the system without a significant backlash. And I think you're seeing that in places like Tennessee, where the UAW just, got a 73% vote in a was it a Toyota factory or a Mercedes factory or BMW, I think. So like some of this stuff will naturally start to come back. The pendulum will start to swing, however slowly. But at the end of the day, right, like government has a fairly limited number of roles. It's like protect your people. That's literally job one. Protect the people. And there are plenty of different things you can say about that. What's the definition of protecting the people? And everybody will have a different thing. But I think getting rid of Trump now is the first step back towards that. Oh, yeah. And then I think if Biden wins and Trump loses, we're, to your point about realignment, I think that we are in for a massive upheaval inside both parties. Because you're going to have, an 82-year-old man as president in one, and a 79-year-old loser in the other. But a lot of younger, just younger politicians by dint of ambition and time are going to be like, okay, it's time for you all to go. It's time for you to leave. Right. I know the baby boomers and the lost generation, you've been in charge for 30 or 40 years, but like, it's time for you to go now. Right. And I think that pressure, and then, the pressure of ideological, right? So you've got age coming down and you've got ideology swinging wildly back and forth inside both parties, is going to create both a lot of chaos inside those parties. But I think, to your first question, which I've now gone way too long on answering, a lot of opportunity for new options.
Right. Well, there's a lot more to discuss. Reed, I love this conversation. We've been long overdue to have it. Obviously, to those listening, if you haven't been living under a rock, you've heard of the Lincoln Project, and we all thank them for their work. I consider myself, a spiritual member because of, we're fighting the same fight and we know it, and we're not Democrats either, but we care about the country. And again, I Reed and Rick and all of you. And as I say all the time, democracy, 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 country over party. It would be lovely to talk about just tax policy and defense policy, but how quaint. We are not living in our quaint times anymore. So let's get real. Reed, thank you for joining the program. Tell everybody, if they don't already, where to find you on the socials.
Sure. First and foremost, you can find me on Substack at the HomeFront. I hope you'll check it out and sign up. And then on Twitter and TikTok, as long as those things are around in their own forms, at Reed Galen. And then on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA.
Awesome. All right. Well, indispensable as always. Thanks, guys, for listening. As always, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.